Welcome back to another episode of Taking Inventory. This week, we welcome Rob Leathern, who has a storied career in tech, in ad tech. He's been leading product teams at Google, led the ads business at LinkedIn, has been at Meta, founded and sold a company called Optimal. And actually, James, you've got some stories about Optimal, don't you?
Yeah, we were part of the same acquisition class, I guess you could call it, back in the day. But yeah, Rob, thank you for doing this. And obviously, I've known you for a long time from when we were kind of both on like the third party vendor ad side, and then just watching the stuff that you have done and did. Meta and Google is very cool and has had an extremely big impact kind of on the industry in general. So very happy to have you here. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be chatting to you guys.
So I think, maybe just a good place to start, just given how you've been on sort of both sides, like as, vendor technology and then the platform side. Like, could you just give us kind of a background on the origin story of how you've now gotten to the place where I think when it comes to like privacy and trust, there's probably no one more credible on it. But how did you get to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I spent a few years working on the advertising business, online advertising, way back maybe 20 years ago, and started doing that, and then via a couple of different things, got into ad tech and started a business in that space. And through that process, just being in that industry, I saw a lot of sketchy behavior, shall we say. I mean, if you're in the kind of ad network business in the early 2010s, definitely there was just a bunch of stuff going on there as that business was getting going. Um, and that kind of gave me, a bunch of background that I also was able to utilize, and sort of understanding that I could utilize when I went to work at Facebook, helping to grow their ads integrity team, build out some of those functions. And on the privacy side, I'd been a research analyst actually even before I got into online advertising. And one of the areas I spent a bunch of time looking at, I looked at digital identity, authentication, and online privacy as part of the stuff that I was working on way back then in the early days of Jupiter, which later became part of Forrester Research. So, when I left Facebook to go to Google at the very beginning of 2021. So started working there on as part of the central privacy team, working on a variety of different things across the company related to data protection and user privacy. So definitely have had a lot of interesting experiences, and obviously some of these things have trade-offs one with the other, whether it's monetization and privacy and safety, etc. So I think definitely have been lucky and fortunate to have the chance to see a bunch of these things at play in some big companies.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because I saw in your background you have a CFA, and that, yeah, for anyone listening, that's no joke. That is a big commitment. And so to hear from your analyst days, kind of what went on there, but like, was there a moment, I think in the early days when you were an analyst and then moving as you kind of had the first steps into tech, like how has kind of data and privacy and kind of integrity and kind of this whole space, how has it evolved over time? Like, has there actually been a lot of change since then? Or um, like, have we been operating in the same mode for the last 15, 20 years?
Um, I think the data on that's somewhat mixed, which is that from research I did, gosh, 20 plus years ago, 22 years ago, uh, consumers have always been concerned about where their data is going and what's happening to it online. They've been concerned with the security of sites that they're using, passwords, etc. It's been an area that's been less familiar to them. They've often looked to other businesses and companies as things that they understand, or you could even say trust more, like banks and credit card companies and so on, who they've been trusting with their personal data for even longer. But even back then, even though people said that they were concerned, it was also just very difficult for them to feel like they could actually take action to protect their data. They kind of, in general, grudgingly, got online, gave their credit card. In the early days of e-commerce, people were afraid to use their credit card, but they kind of got there. And I think this has been the thing that I've seen continue, which is that people say they're concerned, but they don't read privacy policies. And again, we all know why, because they're very, very hard to read. Um, the industry has tried various things to try to address that and make it easier for people, but still it's challenging. So they say that they're concerned, but they still don't necessarily take the steps that would protect their data or refuse to use certain services where perhaps the trust characteristics are a little bit more challenging. At the same time, though, for the businesses in the space, the value of consumer data, the value of providing these services have just continued to increase. The number of things that people are doing online has just continued to grow. And so the costs to companies of those pieces going away have just increased more and more. So I think there's like some interesting trends here, but fundamentally, there's just still a lot of the same consumer problems and the consumer issues. I think the degree to which people actually can exercise agency over their own data and safety, I think hasn't necessarily hasn't necessarily changed as much as perhaps I would have liked it to.
And I guess from just from the experience, maybe starting at Meta, seeing firsthand look kind of all the different actors and in particular like business actors, I guess that um may or may not have like kind of nefarious goals. Like I feel like one thing you did that was so cool there was just and I know you worked on a lot of products, but Ads Library was one of them, which
Mhm.
I think has become like an industry standard. And it really just gave transparency to like what the hell is going on from a pure kind of business perspective. But beyond even that, like, were you surprised when you got in there, just like how, I guess, like how intent businesses were on, on like sort of, I guess, maybe like defrauding these systems or tricking these systems? Or is it better or worse than we think, maybe just given now that you've had a look under the hood?
Yeah, look, I'd say a couple things stand out. Um, number one, I think most businesses and most people are not trying to, pull a fast one. Um, Most of the actors out there are just trying their best to sell products. They're actually going to send those products to consumers. Um, you know, that said, ingenuity of bad actors, the lengths to which they'll go to try to figure out holes in any system that is put forth, that was surprising to me in that, just to see that in action. They'll literally find any gap, any hole, any issue that you may have, and then once they find it, they'll try to scale. And then I think that's the third point, which I think is also an interesting one, is just how different it is to try to build these systems and manage these problems at scale. That is just something that is not simple, not easy, and it's a bit it's kind of like whenever you would say it working at a Facebook, Meta, or Google, that it's just really hard to do this stuff at scale. People will kind of roll their eyes. But it is really challenging sometimes because the problems take on different characteristics. Um, and also, the other thing I'd say is just, all of this is done within the framework of trying, what is the business, what is the company, what is the platform trying to accomplish? And for example, Meta, working on ads there, it was really important that small businesses all over the world had access to the platform. So some of the things that someone who has a different kind of platform or a different view of what the role of the platform is might clamp down on things in a much more specific way. We didn't really want to do that. We wanted to make sure that we could keep the system as open as possible to someone who, again, is a small new business in some foreign country that might be able to sell things to people in other countries. And again, that just makes the problems more difficult. But, it meant that we had to come up with additional ways to figure out how to stop those behaviors, how to understand the intent of folks, how to understand the content in more detail. So again, it just always is relative to some of the goals of the business that you're operating.
And given the complexity of that business, I mean, I can't even kind of wrap my head around, I guess, like how complicated the B2B components of something like Meta is. But one thing I remember seeing you write about and just kind of conversations I saw in the press with you and them was just like the regulators also became like a pretty important part of all this. And is that something that, like for people who don't have exposure to that, and probably are, I think in some cases, maybe like skeptical of their understanding of the problem sets, like, do you have any kind of interesting takeaways from that? And I felt like I saw you talking about this constantly and being in that sort of conversation for during that period of time. So yeah, just sort of curious what that was like.
Yeah, look, I think it's important in these conversations to understand with regulators especially, but also with others, other folks, is to really also deeply understand the good use cases you're trying to support. So, um, one of the great things about Meta was, we spent a lot of time talking to businesses that were affected by changes we made on the policy side. We weren't just trying to stop bad guys; we're also trying to make sure we can continue to support the good use cases to allow those small businesses to thrive, to allow big businesses to reach their customer base, and so on. Um, and I think there's also just a really, as you know, these systems have gotten so complex over the decades that they've been operational. Again, they're still pretty new, but they're exceedingly complicated. So trying to explain those to regulators was something that was definitely a part of many of our jobs. It was also really important, I think, that those conversations with regulators are not just had by policy folks. It's really important for product and engineering folks to be able to be in those conversations as well, because they understand some of those trade-offs that you're making whenever you're designing a system. There's trade-offs between, transparency and openness, and the ability for bad guys to figure out ways around these systems and make it harder for everyone to run them. So I do think that it's important to, and this is one of the things we're seeing with AI as well, right? Is that there's a huge knowledge gap between the practitioners, the engineers, even the folks inside some of those same companies who work on the policy side and are trying to have some of those conversations with, public policy folks or regulators, and then those regulators themselves. So I really think having more of these discussions, trying to capture some of that nuance, bringing in journalists too, because sometimes journalists are helping to translate those things for the public. All of that was very important, and definitely was a part of my job when I worked on this stuff directly.
And so at some of the companies you're at, like obviously this goes beyond just ads. We understand it in the context of ads, and obviously I think consumers understand it there because they see it. They tangibly see the ads that they're served, and when there's data involved, they're typically better. When data gets removed, they're typically less relevant. But what is that balance of like we need to implement stricter and more stringent privacy policies or data policies versus, you know, maybe we need to make sure the product is right. We don't want to over-index on these stringent policies before we actually know the use cases or know the actual problems. And then you've kind of explained too, there's this kind of third party piece of it where like regulators are getting involved. So you're trying to maybe preempt regulator scrutiny, but not again over-index and create a less desirable product. So like, what is the experience of like balancing all of this?
Um, I think we're in a kind of an interesting time because, companies like Facebook, Meta, I never know, when I worked there was Facebook, but anyway, yes, companies like Meta and Google and a lot of companies in the Valley historically have been very, when it comes to, for example, working with developers, look, they've shipped some APIs. We were in this business, we worked on this stuff. And then they let, those developers also come up with novel uses of data, novel products, novel ways to interact with consumers. Sometimes they took those learnings and incorporated into their product, which can be great or terrible for developers depending on how they do that. So I think we're at an interesting time because some of the ways in which people are going to use data and going to use create, whether it's advertising experiences or building generative AI images or text outputs or whatever, there's gonna be some bad stuff there that's going to be really hard to trace back to how and where it was created. And so the open question I have, or I'm interested in seeing what changes right now, is like whether some of those very permissive developer policies change. We put more burden on the platforms to know who the developers are that are using the product. How do you balance that with the friction that you might add for those developers to get going? Because you also, a lot of the uses of your product are not ones you thought of ahead of time, and often they're wonderful and they're great. And I think this is true as well with advertising as well. Um, with the one caveat though, that also when it comes to ads, like sometimes advertisers will do stuff where they actually argue, fight against their own interests. They think they know their audience and they'll create some targeting and do a bunch of stuff on their side. But in fact, sometimes the AI models that Google or someone else has can actually figure out who to show the ads to far better um, than the advertiser could. So I think there's like going to be a bunch of these like interesting little interplays. But I also feel like we're at this just strange inflection point right now between how these companies think about their role. How much do they do themselves? How much do they kind of hand that off to others as well?
Yeah, and maybe you kind of touched on this about like kind of the, I guess, unintended, I guess, consequences or just like the surprises that come with it. I guess going from Meta to Google, where like Google, and I know Meta has like a form of operating system that they're working on, but like Google has Android. I mean, it's like
Mhm.
the most used OS in the world. The amount of data that can collect in theory, the amount of countries that it's like so core to has got to be just sort of mind boggling. Like, was that an interesting place to sort of sit back and think, how do we handle privacy security when you're the OS and all this? And how do you think that does unfold over time? I guess like as you kind of have this Google, Meta, Apple fight, like, and I guess maybe one follow up to that would just like is when you see what Apple's doing and their focus on privacy, does that seem like they're doing it right, or is that
Mhm.
like a lot of just sort of noise that that is kind of good for commercials?
Well, look, I think Apple doesn't have some of the business model constraints that someone like Google does. Where, you're making more money on your selling devices versus on the other side you're making money selling ads. And again, you're making money from devices. But if you look at the overall picture, and also the way Google is just a very decentralized place. Folks are running somewhat separate businesses versus a company like Meta is. There's definitely different business lines, but also um, it's still a founder led company. And so a lot of the, back and forth and disputes and direction that, the company is taking and back and forths that different senior leaders at the company might have can be arbitrated more easily than say Google. So that said, I'm no longer privy to the inner workings of Google, so that, some of these things may have shifted, but um, there are some real questions about how you balance, a multi-hundred-billion-dollar ad business with some of the changes that they want to make. I mean, this is part of the discussion with Privacy Sandbox and making some of those changes there that may well have negative impacts on the business, on the ads business. I wrote something a couple weeks ago where I talked about. We haven't really heard a ton of detail from Google or Meta, frankly, on how they're going to use some of their own AI, generative AI, and other, newer AI products on their own ads businesses, right? So, you know, are they going to aggressively, try to flag things that they think might be harmful? You can go to ChatGPT and spend, you can have a ChatGPT 4 subscription and you can upload images of ads or even text messages that you might get saying you should go claim your FedEx package and pay $261 to pay, customs duties, which is obviously seems like pretty much like a scam. But you can go and use these tools now to find out a pretty good score of whether something's a scam. So, I think there's just this real question of where and how those technologies are going to be integrated, and how you trade off the different business units, business lines that these folks have. Um, and I think it's a very challenging. I feel like it's a more challenging question for Google, quite frankly, to your point, James. That's just not going to be as easy to figure out.
Do you have then like a strong perspective? I know you've written some about this, but as AI gets more, as kind of general consumers start to use it more and more, um, for ads, for personal use, I mean, we're starting to see data get sold, right? As a product. Reddit recently kind of sold their data. There's conversations about Quora and YouTube, having the largest repository of data. And this is data that, as far as we understand, has been used very minutely for ads and other use cases, but now it is getting pushed into these LLMs that essentially is kind of just any use case. And so, like, what is your perspective on this next wave of data usage and data privacy? And now it is assumingly just all data can be used for anything.
Yeah. So I think data sources that are private, or so like if you have a data source that's not been exposed to the internet and is your own, that's obviously going to be valuable. Also, if you can cordon off data where or information where now you might be having AI output in your inputs, that's also going to be something to be careful of. So I was talking to someone about this recently, which was, the same way we have a seed bank of, seeds that are not tainted by GMOs or whatever it is. It's like you choose your thing. That'll actually become important. Like if you are all of a sudden having online content where, you may not just have original source material, but you have SEO spam, you have stuff that's been generated by LLMs. Everything's just gonna get dumber and dumber. So I think there's a real information quality set of concerns on that front. So if you look at folks who have training data that may not be easy to find or easy to replicate, you have ways to isolate data sets in such a way so that you're not getting pollution in your inputs. Those are all going to just be important factors. So I think there's really like a lot of interesting things around that too to think about.
Yeah, and this is kind of a tangent, but I was randomly thinking about this last night when my kid was up screaming. But will this become, I guess for like the ensuring like the source material is like true source material, is this finally like a good use case for a lot of blockchain technology where like public content should get written to some graph?
Yeah.
Is that like where this is kind of going?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly might be content provenance, and other use cases there might actually be really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think some folks have said Web3 is kind of a solution in search of a problem. So there's definitely going to be needs for that. I think that said, though, I think watermarking, other things, to the point we made earlier about bad guys defeating this stuff. I mean, they're going to defeat this stuff. I was very worried. I wrote something about, I found some scam videos that were deep fakes, and I was just worried about sharing them without putting some watermark on it but of course it's so easy to find this stuff that out there. And it just, you're just going to see this stuff continue to get worse and worse. So I do think that we're going to have to come up with ways to watermark stuff, add labels. We're going to have to perhaps spend more energy on digital identity. So knowing that this is the New York Times and it's their official site. And one of the things my team was responsible for at Facebook Meta was the Blue Badge program on the product side. A lot of that stuff is still very challenging to do well. And some folks have done it very poorly, like X has not done it very well. I was actually hopeful that it would be a really good restart for them if they really wanted to make authenticity a thing, but they chose to make having a credit card a thing, which isn't the same thing. So,
and yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about and with kind of X and the blue watermarks, there's a lot of like commercial bad actors trying to extract value in kind of nefarious ways. But then there's also, I mean, we're in an election year, so we have to talk about it. Foreign actors, right? Foreign actors using this for either, disinformation campaigns or kind of further dividing societies or kind of people's positions. But how did you spend your time looking at kind of the commercial impact versus maybe this larger impact of like foreign actors coming in and trying to use these systems to create a lot more chaos than just kind of nefarious commercial activity?
Yeah, in some ways, it's easier to counter financial incentives because you kind of know the contours of that. If someone, if someone's trying to, spend, if someone's willing to spend $1 on an ad, well, actually, let me take this back. If someone's willing to spend $1 with a real credit card on an ad, let's not count stolen credit cards because that's also a thing. But you kind of know they're going to have to try to make more than $1 out of it, so you can start to understand the contours. If they're trying to just cause chaos or social unrest or other things, whether they're using ads or organic content or other mechanisms to get there, that just creates a more difficult environment. Um, and the reality as well is, while we have mechanisms for verifying people's identities in certain countries, it's not 100% in even the best of those countries. There's a lot of countries and places that have elections that are democratic that don't have identity systems, where the social conventions are difficult to be able to do those things. So um, you end up with kind of a patchwork. No matter what how well intended it is, you're going to still end up with a patchwork. You're going to have to work with vendors to do those things. So um, it's a challenging problem to solve in a way that feels fair globally.
And I don't know if you can say anything about this, but like when you were at like Google, you know, is like the United States government like checking in and being like, guys, like please make sure you don't let anything crazy happen here. Like how involved, aware are they, or is it really kind of more like a passive kind of relationship?
Well, I mean, look, there's definitely a lot of interactions that happen, in DC. In the case of the U.S., there's definitely a lot of folks who want to hold big tech companies accountable. In some cases, there's political considerations they might have as to what they can say publicly versus what people on their staff might say, not publicly. But there's definitely good connections, good connection points. Um, there's also a lot of interaction that happens on the security front because there's lots of foreign actors who are trying to do things there. Um, so I would say that there's a lot of good discussion that goes on. Not all of it is stuff that gets out into the public domain, but um, we also just are in a place where I would say the U.S. government and all the different parties don't necessarily work well together. And so, and sometimes, as you've seen from some of these congressional or Senate hearings, there's a lot of that time that I don't think is well used to discuss the actual issues. I would like to see more time spent on actually trying to deal with some of these security, privacy, safety trade-offs. Again, like things like kids' privacy and kids' safety are ones where people seem to be able to get behind, but they still, I think spend too much time taking shots at each other versus actually coming up with concrete proposals to protect people. So I think there's a lot of work we could still do there in the U.S. And so I'd like to see more effort there for sure.
And do you see, like, the U.S. obviously has an approach to privacy and an approach to um, interacting with tech companies, specifically on their data privacies, their effect on children, and we've seen recent Senate hearings. And then across the pond, the EU has a much more aggressive stance, right? They've blocked the Activision and Microsoft deals. Like they're taking a much more aggressive stance on a lot of technology kind of work and GDPR and whatnot. Like, how does that play into it? Where you've got different governments taking different types of stances, and you know, I guess how does that affect kind of your approach to it? You may satisfy the U.S. concerns, but the EU may have a much different view.
Yeah, I mean, one to probably oversimplify it, you might say that when it comes to antitrust and privacy and related concerns, and say online safety as well, the UK and Europe is probably like um, it's probably over regulating, and the US is under regulating. And so, but what ends up happening then is that the people working on these problems at these big companies, even though they're big companies with tens of thousands of engineers. They can't work on everything. So what you end up with is a lot of folks working on compliance for EU and UK programs. Um, and while we don't have federal privacy legislation in the US, while there's a lot of missing pieces, you're going to just see a lot of those other approaches, those other countries' regulations be implemented, um, which again might be great. But what you're then going to see is you're going to see um, less protections for people in other countries that are not putting their foot down on this regulatory scheme. Whereas what you could have had was, if there was more, maybe not quite as stringent a set of things that was, meeting 80-90% of the needs that a lot more countries had, you could have actually better privacy for everyone. Instead, you're going to have this, again, patchwork. You're seeing this also in the US with state laws. You're going to see a patchwork of identity, privacy, and other regulations that are just going to mean that it's a very disjointed experience. People will be able to, and will try to circumvent these things. They'll use VPNs, they'll do other things to pretend that they're coming from, Wisconsin instead of Washington, just to choose two random states. So it's going to be messy. Whereas it could have been, with more discussion, open conversation, a better deal for everyone. It's just not going to be there, at least for the next few years, I don't think.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, guess switching gears to maybe another W, not a state, but the Walmart news today about Vizio. I saw you tweeting about it, and that one strikes me as like an example. I was unaware. Maybe this would be helpful for listeners, but like the class action lawsuits against Vizio, like, could you kind of explain to people just like some of the privacy issues and what this actually could represent? And then second to that is just like, do you see more of these types of acquisitions happening where like you could argue there's like some pretty interesting privacy concerns that comes with these types of things?
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think there's a bunch of what you might call secondary platforms where we're all using them and we're not paying as much attention to the data practices. TV is one of them. I think your car, or your phone when you're in your car, that's another example. And I think in the Vizio case, um, you had a bunch of folks who filed a class action lawsuit. It was probably 6-7 years ago, maybe even longer. Maybe it was 2015, 2016. But it was essentially that they weren't being, informed that Vizio was using their data. And this kind of gets back to my point about there not really being federal privacy legislation that makes sense. I think if you look at the that particular case, there was they used a few different laws to try to go after Vizio in that case. The Video Privacy Protection Act, the one where you're not supposed to share what videos people are renting from the video store. I mean, literally. There was another federal wiretapping statute that I think they were invoking, etc. I'm not a lawyer, so you should read this stuff yourself and don't take my my legal analysis. But just very interesting that this patchwork of laws, this patchwork of approaches. I think consumers, throw up right, perhaps logically throw up their hands and say, "I don't really know. I'm not going to worry about it as much." Then there's certain states where they like California, that bring out laws and harness and focus people's attention more. Companies do stuff to comply. Maybe that then brings it back into the conversation. I tweeted out the data of how, Walmart publishes on its website how many California privacy requests it gets every year. And I think they said, in terms of looking at your information, all of 2022, they got 16,000. I'd be really interested to see what the 2023 numbers will be. But these are pretty small numbers compared to how many people are using even the Walmart website, let alone going into the stores. So that's on the privacy side. On the other side, though, I do think that as third-party data access becomes more sketchy or constrained because of changes that are being made by browser companies or others, it does mean that first-party data will become more valuable. It'll probably mean there'll be more acquisitions like this. People trying to build out ad networks. have access to data, be able to give people things that are actually adding value to them. Obviously, if you're going to get to have a better deal on a product that you're already buying, or you're going to learn about new products that other people like you have experienced and enjoyed, those are great things for consumers. So, again, I think it's about finding the right balance. I don't feel like we found the right balance yet. Don't use my data at all doesn't seem like the right side. I don't care about how you use my data also doesn't seem right. We're kind of in this weird middle right now. So I do think we need to get to a set of things that people, at least in the US and in other countries, can feel good about. Deals like this and how regulators respond to them will be an interesting clue, I think, because it follows a slightly different process than trying to come up with federal privacy legislation in the US. So it'll be really interesting to see how markets or how regulators and not only markets, but how regulators react to this potential deal.
So deals like this, like in your perspective, is this a net positive or kind of net negative as we start to move forward, where big companies start to aggregate this data, where Walmart now has kind of this very large graph of first party data. Facebook's got theirs, Google has theirs. Is that a net positive, or would you like to see it more open where there's a standardization for more parties to use?
I think on balance, I'd say it's positive because I think bigger companies are going to get away with less than smaller companies might. That said, then if it gets much, much bigger, well, then, there's market power. There's other things that potentially fight against the establishment of standards that, might be consumer beneficial. So there's a bit of a balance, but I do think that, these businesses compared to the overall business of someone like a Walmart, it's still pretty small. I do think having scale can really add a ton of value for consumers. So I do think that right now, I'd probably on balance say this kind of thing is positive. And I think people will hold a Walmart more accountable than a Vizio, quite honestly, in terms of data practices and other protections. So on balance, I'd say it's positive, but we're going to have to also figure out ways to, as these things get much, much bigger, figure out what those contours look like. And again, that's still to be determined, I think. What do you think, James?
I think it's really smart. I think that I agree with you that, I tend to be thankful we have companies the size of like Facebook and Google, because we saw firsthand at Snap how hard it is to stand up these programs and to police the bad actors. And I think we did a great job, but it's hard, super expensive,
Mhm.
and it's just complicated. And so, I think it ends up being like, I'm thankful these companies are American companies, to be honest, a lot of cases. And I think this is going to be actually a really cool user experience. I think there's a bunch of stuff they can do around like Walmart doing exclusives with content. They have a history doing that with music. There's cool stuff they could do here. It's probably not great for Roku, but yeah, I think it would be cool. And I think it's another example though of like, it is a little bit of like the rich get richer. And I've tweeted about this before where like, I'm fascinated by how much leverage a business can create by owning the merchant relationship.
Mhm.
And like Google and Meta and Walmart and Amazon have done such a good job with that. And then, if you're going to be intellectually honest about it, it's like Snap never could nail that. And so you kind of just see the difference of leverage. And, it's like this like almost humbling of the supply side, because like it kind of doesn't matter as much,
Yeah.
as long as you have all those merchant relationships. Um, so yeah, I think it's like really, really fascinating. But I mean, I have a Vizio. It's when I was when I did start looking at my Vizio on the wall differently. I was like, okay, this is gonna know everything about me now. I knew it. I guess it already did, but now I really know it will. It's like
Yeah.
we have friends at Walmart. They're smart. They're gonna figure it out. So that's my overarching kind of take on it. But I'd be scared. I mean, I will say, you know, I saw you tweeted about this, the Wise Cam stuff. You know, they're starting to get a point where like these hardware you know, these hardware companies are in a very privileged place. Like they're in your home, they're watching your kids, they're doing things like that. And like I guess I trust Walmart more than I would Vizio alone. And so just in terms of their willingness and sort of eagerness to police themselves. Um, so that was kind of my gut reaction to it.
Yeah, I guess a relevant point on this is I've had some Wise cams, and this is not their first privacy security issue. I don't have them in any sensitive areas, let's put it that way. But I think I'm finally going to now switch out to Blink. I have a couple Blink cameras which are just owned by Amazon, and I'm like, okay, great, going to switch out to the Blink. But the reality is, I can look at my Blink cameras on my Amazon Show, but I also have to look at ads. Amazon actually shows ads on the Echo Show device in a way that Google Nest products never have. And so it's also interesting that these different companies have different approaches to, okay, you bought the hardware, it's in your house, you paid for it, you maybe even pay a subscription fee for related services, but I'm still going to show you ads on the device. And so I don't know, like it's some of these things, can you give me the package to be able to turn off ads? I'll pay an extra $10 a month. Like, I just don't want to see ads for toilet paper I'd rather see the photo frame 24/7. If anyone knows, by the way, how to turn an Echo Show
Yeah.
to not show toilet
Turn
paper
off.
or any ads, please let me know, DM me, just so I can figure that out.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because I saw when you tweeted the Wise Cam thing, I sent it to a buddy of mine who has Wise Cams all over his house. And because I've been like, this is like this company. I'd seen some stuff in the past as well. And then we started looking at other solutions of like, okay, maybe you should get like a hardwired camera solution and a server in your house. Right. And then we started looking at the number one on Amazon. I actually have the text up right here. It's this company called Amcrest,
Mm.
but it's this subsidiary of a company called Foscam, a Chinese video products manufacturer. So it's like, like you're sort of, it's just the whole thing is just so messy. So I think again, like kind of looking at Vizio now, it's like there is something nice to know about like there's a way to hold Walmart accountable, or at least there's a better way to hold them accountable. And so
Yeah.
maybe this will just end up being a better kind of net effect.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think for me the balance is I want to be open to small companies, whether they're in the US or not, having the opportunity to deliver great products and services. Some of them will get acquired by other companies, some of them will be big standalone ones, but I think it's also up to these platforms to put in place the right policies, and that so consumers can feel like there's a level of due diligence that's been done about the folks in their ecosystem. It isn't just a, hey, we let anyone into the app store or whatever it is, and every now and then a security researcher is going to write a report and we'll take down 15 of them. That's not the model I want. And so I feel like we haven't quite landed on the exact right model for third-party developers in these ecosystems. And but yeah, I think we'll get there. I think it's just going to take a little bit of time to figure out that balance between owning all the data and making it available to developers, and giving smaller companies the ability to show that they actually can build something of value that the big companies couldn't or wouldn't have thought of ahead of time.
Part of the onus is on the consumer at the end of the day. I mean, James is talking about looking at the cameras, looking at the subsidiaries, and going down the rabbit hole to make an informed choice. But you open the conversation just saying if consumers don't read the privacy policies, and for good reason. I mean, it's designed for us not to read them. So I guess as we close out, it's two questions. One, if you could kind of wave a magic wand, like what would you want consumers to do to be a little more participatory in kind of their privacy protection? But then, what are you excited about? We've talked about a lot of challenges and a lot of things happening in the industry, not all bad, but like, what are you most excited about and bullish on as we move forward?
Yeah. So two things. So on the what can people do? Um, I tweeted about this a little bit, and then I was talking to a reporter about this specific issue where I got an email from Toyota saying that I'm going to be offered some special insurance rate because of my safe driving behavior, and so this sent me down the rabbit hole of, wait, did I opt into that? And turns out I did at the dealer. I must have checked some box or something when I got a new Toyota last year. Um, and so, yes, they've been tracking all my information. And so I went through the process of requesting my data. And so I'd say to people like, um, you don't have to do it for everything. It doesn't have to be your car, but go through, try to download your information from one of these companies or request a copy of your data or do something like that. Because I think, I find that just having these discussions in the abstract is difficult. Everyone's going to, of course, you're going to say you care about your data, but like, just go look and see what they know about you, what they're saying about you, what they say they're using or how they're saying they use it. I think that's really useful. And, I definitely think that's something that people can do with their parents, with their kids. You can kind of have this be like try to way to understand some of this stuff a bit better with, members of your family. And then in terms of what I'm excited about though, I've been spending a lot of time looking at AI stuff and LLMs and so on. I'm really excited about using these for safety, for stopping scammers or reducing those things. I think there's definitely a lot that people are writing about deepfakes and other things, but I actually think these can, based on what I've seen and having worked on these problems directly, I think there's a ton of stuff that can be done to layer these into ad review processes, review the messages that are getting sent to your phone, the text messages, things like that. There's a lot where these technologies can be used to really significantly, even if it's just slowing someone down from doing something like, oh my gosh, I need to pay customs duty on this package that's waiting for me, at the port. Were you expecting something at the port? Well, even just slowing people down, asking a couple of questions, will be really useful. So I'm very positive actually that some of these technologies that people are rightfully worried about as well, being used for bad, can also be used for good purposes, for sure.
Yeah. One comment on that too is we have all of a mutual friend. I won't say his name, but he's a ad tech product manager leader. And I talked to him about like, hey, I have a buddy who wants to start a company. What should that friend start? And he was like, someone needs to build something basically better for ad review, just because the creative review process is like so brutal using some of these LLMs. And it's such like an inside baseball problem, but it's like, it's so impactful. And like, it would actually be really, really, like I do think there's like a lot of this like defensive tech that could be really cool. I don't know if it's broad enough to be standalone companies, but like it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, agree.
And yeah, I'm excited to see where it all goes.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, it's gonna get interesting. And I will say, if you ever want to judge the seriousness of how much someone cares about privacy, it is suggesting that we do privacy policy reviews with our kids is a good one. I'm gonna
No,
try it.
not privacy.
Uh,
To be clear, don't read the policy. Just see what data they have about
request.
you, because that
Yeah.
is different. Those two things are diametrically opposite of it.
Okay, good. Okay, good. It's like, yeah, I've tried talking to my wife into the idea that we like tax some, the allowance one day. This will be like the next one on top of that.
Um,
But well, thank you again, man. I really appreciate it. And excited to see what you end up doing next. But thank you for taking the time and for doing all the work you've been doing to help consumers and these platforms. It's really cool to see. So thanks again.
Appreciate the time, guys. Really great to chat.